I'm just going to start with a little anecdote. I don't actually think it's true, but I just came and I sort of Googled for background information and none's forthcoming. But it's a lovely little story, even if it isn't true. It is said that in the 18th century, when the British Empire was colonising what became Canada in the area that was British Columbia, they met one of the local tribal chiefs to negotiate the fact that he was now a subject of Her Majesty, His Majesty probably at the time, Georgian times. I think their idea of negotiating was probably more along these lines. But the British Columbian chief, this is a real living British Columbian chief, but that's just to make a good picture. He turned round to the leader of the British troops and says, "If you own this land, tell me the stories of this land," which of course was a bit beyond the remit of the colonel or the brigadier or whoever it was that we're dealing with. But I rather felt myself in exactly the same position about 18 months ago when I had the very good fortune to, without planning to end up living in Avebury village, in the only house on the Henge bank, just to add a little bit of oomph to it. I've been visiting Avebury many times, and that's the years quite frequently, but starting in about 1980. So I thought I knew a little bit about Avebury. But I turned up there, and you suddenly realise, actually, I don't know the stories of this land. Now, of course, there are a great many stories, a great many narratives. These are the sort of narratives that I was probably most familiar with at the time, the sort of narratives put together by archaeologists. They may not think of them as stories as such, although I think the best of those, like Josh Pollard and so forth, Mark Gillings, would fully accept that point. Very technical narratives here. But it wasn't quite the sort of stories that I had in mind. They're informative, but not the sort of story that the British Columbian chief would recognise. So I began to sort of put together what I thought might be plausible to say about the stories of Avebury and the associated area. As Hugh has said, it's all about a book, but then again, I suspect that many of the speakers at Megalithomania are also busily promoting their latest book as well. It's about Avebury. It's about that big Neolithic landscape that became part of the World Heritage Site, which extends several miles in each direction away from the Henge itself. But my focus of interest was very specifically on this place. This is the source of the river, or the start of the River Kennet. Some of you know Swallowhead Springs, which is just off these stepping stones. If you're trying to get your directions, that's London. Due east, about 120 miles, it has to be said. Nominally, stepping stones mark where the water from the Winterbourne is flowing down from stage this left, meeting the water from Swallowhead Springs here, and this is officially the start of the River Kennet. Same water as the Winterbourne, but it changes its name when it turns direction, flowing due east. Get your bearings a little bit better. Here's Avebury, here's London, and I think most of you are familiar with the fact that the Kennet flows down to Reading, where it joins the upper reaches of the Thames, which are in the Cotswolds, and then obviously I think most of you will be familiar with the geography of the Thames through the London Basin and so forth. But essentially the Kennet and the Thames make the most consistently east-flowing river in southern Britain. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that is something which would have been respected. The confluence at Reading, if you want to visit it, it's quite easy. You can park there. It's now Tesco's car park. But you'll be well aware that the Thames at that point is a much bigger river than the Kennet. But my thinking, for the purpose of this talk, is really that the lower reaches of the Thames and the Kennet as effectively one river system. Were I sort of doing that sort of journey from the Thames estuary back up to what's now Avebury, any time from sort of 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, that is the sort of river system. The black dots are Mesolithic sites, usually occupation sites, little hunting camps and so forth. You see, rather interestingly, they do associate it with the Kennet part of the valley, genuinely are missing from, or at least not known, and this is perhaps more accurate, not known in the Cotswolds area. So this is a key river system from approximately 10,000 years ago. What were the Mesolithic people doing? They were doing something like this 10,000 years ago. they were recolonising the land as the last ice age shrunk back. They had a lifestyle quite similar to the Inuits of Greenland and so forth. It wasn't all ice flows, clearly, just as Greenland now has some land which is used, but it would have been a hunter-gathering lifestyle. Probably culturally and in terms of social culture and material culture, quite as complex as we associate with the Inuits and so forth. There's no reason to suspect it was any less complex. It's just that the archaeology simply doesn't provide leather and fur and hide and so forth, bark. By the time they're building the henge, we've moved on from the Mesolithic into the Neolithic, but I think we still have this evidence for a very much waterborne transport. This is the primary way they moved around. Moving around overground would have been secondary. If you've got to take a lot of stuff with you, it's much easier to put it on some sort of boat. And I think this is based on some Minnesota Indians from right at the end of the 19th century. But it's the sort of lifestyle that I imagine the people who built Avebury henge, any other henge, and Neolithic monument, that same sort of sophistication, complexity. And if we think of how many Native American tribes there were when we made colonial contact, again, that same complexity of culture. It wasn't just one Neolithic culture, it wasn't just one Native American tribe. If you're getting around in either the Mesolithic or the Neolithic, clearly there weren't maps. This is as good as it got in terms of maps. Now, I know there's been quite a bit of speculation that for argument's sake, cup and ring marks might be maps. They might be. I think there are probably arguments for several dozen other things that they might be as well. It's not quite the answer to the question. But they certainly did get around. And in the early Neolithic, they were trading polished hand axes. These are mostly examples from the Lake District, Langdondale. These happen to have been found in Leicestershire. But then there's another little axe factory in Leicestershire with examples found throughout Britain and so forth. But the Lake District ones are most common. In Avebury, there are examples of these that have been found. There's even a small fragment about this sort of size, but it is a broken fragment, which has definitely come up from the Lizard Peninsula down in Cornwall. That's the only place that particular type of rock is found. So they were definitely getting around, moving and I don't like the word trade, but something like that, exchanging valuable artifacts. If we want some other secondary evidence that they're getting around by boat, then look at the locations of some of the chamber tombs. These are early Neolithic. These are about 5,000 years ago, very similar in age to, say, West Kennet Long Barrow, the Cotswold 7 Long Barrows, but in this case, this one is Pembrokeshire, part of a group, and this one particularly dramatically on the coast here, and always was on the coast. This is not erosion. Clearly, two things are going on here. One is that when you bury Grandad, he's got a really good view of the waves and so forth. And you remember paddling in as a child and so forth. But what's more interesting, some research that was published about 7 or 8 years ago now, reveals that these are very good sea marks. When you're out in that estuary, there happens to be a rather significant sandbank just here, which, whilst you're not likely to run aground, would definitely change the tidal flow. So when you see that particular tomb, you know where you are in terms of getting about on the Pembrokeshire coast. More examples, I could give you a lot. Here we're in the Dumfries Galloway Peninsula of Scotland, and one of the Cairn Holy monuments. Sorry, this is a black and white photograph I took many years ago. A bit of oops, and we're actually looking, sea is there. But again, this one works as a very good sea mark. Again, the problem for getting around that peninsula is some very, very fast tidal rips and so forth. So you really need to know where you are and what's going on. The nearest analogy I can give now is to leap forward into the Anglo-Saxon period, just temporarily for a few slides, because one of the problems with dealing with prehistory is that you have no history, you have no written sources. At least with the Anglo-Saxons, they might not have left us everything written down themselves, but we are still speaking Anglo-Saxon words and names and so forth, particularly place names. This is at the Avenue at Avebury. I think many of you have spotted that. I'm not actually interested in the foreground. It's this that interests me. Have you spotted that one? That's Overton Hill. End of the Marlborough Downs, if you like. The sanctuary, if you want your locations, is just over there.